If you're in the north and east getting excited about the cooler air moving in over the next week, here's the part of the forecast you need to hear. It's a pause, not a turning point, and the data behind late August into September tells a pretty clear story about what comes next. We've been tracking two separate stories playing out simultaneously right now: dangerous, record-challenging heat locked in across the southern plains and southwest, and a genuine cool-down pushing into the Great Lakes and Northeast behind an eastern trough. Both of those are real, and both are backed by solid short-range guidance. But zoom out to the extended range, and the signal is unmistakable. This cooler pattern in the north is a temporary intermission, and the heat that's been dominating the south all month is positioned to expand back toward the central and eastern United States as we close out August and open September. Here's the mechanism driving that flip. Long-range guidance has been consistently showing what's known as a positive phase of the East Pacific Oscillation building back in as we move through the final days of August. When that pattern sets up, it places a ridge of high pressure across the central and eastern United States while pushing troughiness out toward the west coast. Essentially, the mirror image of the setup currently allowing cooler air into the Great Lakes and Northeast. Multiple ensemble members and the major global models have shown reasonable agreement on this transition, which is exactly the kind of signal forecasters look for before having real confidence in a pattern change this far out. By the way, if you'd like specific weather forecasts for your region or city, please leave them in the comments. I'll answer them individually as time allows. Also, if you liked the video and subscribed to my channel, you'd be very grateful. Now, let's move on. Let's talk about what this actually looks like on a map. Right now, the ridge responsible for the South's extreme heat sits centered over the southern plains and desert southwest. As we move into the very end of August and the pattern flips back toward that positive phase, extended guidance shows this heat building back toward the north and expanding its footprint eastward, spreading beyond its current southern core into the Central Plains, the Mississippi Valley, and eventually reaching back toward areas that will have just finished enjoying several days of below normal temperatures. Long-range ensemble output, including extended runs of the European model looking at 2-meter temperatures across 7-day averages, continues to show the country holding in an above-average temperature bubble as we head into the first week of September, with only a modest and temporary moderation showing up around the middle of the month before another warm-up phase. This matters most for anyone in the zone currently enjoying that Great Lakes and Northeast cooldown because it means the relief has a fairly defined shelf life. Current trough-driven cooler conditions are expected to hold through roughly the end of this week and into the first part of next week, but as that positive EPO pattern reasserts itself toward the very end of August, the ridge is forecast to reclaim ground across the central and eastern U.S. And areas that just experienced a genuine break from summer heat should expect temperatures to climb back toward above normal readings within a relatively short window afterward. It's also worth explaining why forecasters have reasonable confidence in a pattern flip this far in advance, since extended range forecasting beyond about a week typically comes with much more uncertainty than the short-range outlooks driving the current heat and cooldown stories. The confidence here comes from ensemble agreement rather than any single model run. When the GFS, the European model, and their respective ensemble suites, which each run dozens of slightly varied simulations to capture a range of plausible outcomes, all cluster around a similar transition timing and magnitude, that convergence is treated as a meaningfully stronger signal than any one deterministic run showing the same thing in isolation. That's exactly the situation here, with multiple independent modeling systems arriving at a similar late August EPO transition, which is part of why this outlook is being discussed with real confidence rather than as a speculative long-range possibility. Now here's an important nuance, because the heat comes back doesn't mean the entire country simply reverts to exactly the conditions we're seeing right now. The character of this pattern shift matters. As fronts associated with this transition move through during September, they're expected to sink progressively farther south compared to where they've been riding this summer, especially as we move deeper into the month and toward early October. That's a normal seasonal progression, but it means each successive round of warmth is likely to be interrupted by cooler intrusions that penetrate a bit farther south than what's been typical, gradually setting the stage for the more genuine autumn pattern changes that show up in most years around the middle of September. It's worth breaking down how this plays out region by region, since the return of heat won't feel identical everywhere it touches. Across the Central Plains, including Nebraska, Kansas, and western Missouri, extended guidance shows temperatures climbing back above 100 degrees as the ridge rebuilds, with the hottest anomalies compared to normal actually showing up farther north than where the core of this month's heat has been centered, reaching into areas like western South Dakota and eastern Colorado that have largely been spared the worst of the current heat wave. That's a notable shift in the geography of the risk, and it means places that have felt relatively fortunate through most of August could find themselves squarely in the bullseye as September opens. Across the Mississippi Valley, including Missouri, Arkansas, and into Mississippi itself, the pattern shift is expected to bring a similar northward and eastward expansion of the heat anomaly, with some model guidance suggesting this corridor sees its own stretch of much above normal temperatures beginning right around the start of September. For a region that's already dealt with a humid, oppressive summer, this represents an extension of uncomfortable conditions rather than a fresh event. But it's still worth factoring into any outdoor plans spanning the holiday weekend and the days immediately following. For the Great Lakes and Northeast, the story is somewhat different, since this region is coming off several days of genuine cooler relief before the ridge reasserts itself. Extended temperature guidance suggests the rebound here trends toward above average, rather than the more extreme readings expected farther south and west, meaning the return of warmth in this zone looks more like a resumption of typical late summer conditions than another bout of dangerous heat. That's an important distinction for anyone north of the Ohio Valley trying to gauge how seriously to take this next warm-up compared to what the South has already been experiencing for weeks. There's a useful historical parallel worth mentioning here too, since patterns like this, an EPO flip driving a heat rebound in very late August into early September, aren't unprecedented for a summer that's already trended this persistently hot. Similar late-season heat resurgences have occurred in past years when a strong, well-established ridge has proven resistant to seasonal breakdown, often continuing to reassert itself in pulses through early autumn before a more decisive pattern change finally takes hold, typically sometime around the third week of September in a more typical year. Nothing about the current setup guarantees an identical outcome, but it's a useful frame for understanding why forecasters aren't treating this as a one-time anomaly. Let's also revisit the extreme heat piece specifically, since it's the part of this story with the most immediate stakes. Extended dynamical model guidance has been flagging the potential for a major, long-duration extreme heat event over the southern tier of the country for weeks now, and this next phase of warming is expected to reinforce and expand that same general risk area rather than introduce something entirely new. The greatest risk continues to be flagged from the desert Southwest through the Great Plains, underneath the resurgent mid-level high, which lines up with exactly the areas that have already been dealing with extreme heat warnings and near-record temperatures through most of this month. For the central and eastern U.S. specifically, that expanding heat risk carries real implications heading into the Labor Day holiday and the first full week of September. If you have outdoor plans for that stretch, whether it's a holiday gathering, travel, or the start of fall sports practices and school activities, current guidance suggests building in the expectation of above normal heat, rather than assuming the late August cooldown carries through. Heat indices are likely to climb back into uncomfortable territory across a wide swath of the country as this pattern reasserts itself, even in areas that don't typically think of early September as peak heat season. There's also a longer seasonal thread running through all of this worth understanding because it connects directly to why forecasters have been describing this summer's pattern as unusually persistent. The subtropical ridge behind the current southern heat wave has repeatedly proven capable of rebuilding even after weaker frontal systems have tried to erode it, and the mechanism behind the upcoming EPO flip suggests a similar kind of resilience heading into early fall. Rather than a clean, one-time transition from summer heat into cooler autumn conditions, this year's pattern looks more like a series of pulses, warm stretches interrupted by increasingly assertive cooler intrusions, gradually trending toward genuine fall conditions as September progresses rather than flipping all at once. If you live anywhere in the central or eastern United States, this is the part of the forecast worth filing away, even if it doesn't affect your plans for the next several days specifically. The cool down moving into the Great Lakes and Northeast right now is real and worth enjoying, but treat it as a window rather than a new normal. Confidence remains reasonably high on the broad strokes of this pattern flip based on current ensemble agreement, though the exact magnitude and northward extent of the returning heat will keep getting refined as we move closer to the actual transition in the coming week and a half. For now, the safest assumption is that summer isn't finished with the central and eastern U.S. just yet, even as parts of the north get their first legitimate taste of relief in weeks. One last thing worth watching as this transition unfolds is how it interacts with the Atlantic tropical season, since that's a separate but occasionally overlapping story this time of year. A resurgent ridge across the central and eastern U.S. can influence steering patterns for any tropical systems that develop in the coming weeks, sometimes acting as a block that keeps storms farther out to sea, other times helping funnel moisture northward, well ahead of a system's actual arrival. That's a detail worth keeping an eye on as we move deeper into what's historically the most active stretch of hurricane season, layered on top of everything already unfolding with this heat and pattern transition on the mainland.